The moment that broke Camilla's composure wasn't a headline or a palace statement. It was a quiet conversation in a corridor at Clarence's house, and the person who had it with her wasn't Charles. It was William. And what he said to her was not a threat, and it was not a negotiation. It was a sentence. 4 words that landed with the full institutional weight of a man who had spent 25 years waiting for the legal authority to say them. And when those words reached the people who needed to hear them, every single one of Camilla's carefully placed family members inside the royal machine understood at exactly the same moment that the arrangement they had been living inside for nearly 2 decades was finished. There's a version of this story that the palace would very much prefer you never heard. And that version goes like this. A future king reviewed some institutional arrangements, made some sensible governance decisions, and updated a few outdated structures in line with modern transparency standards. That version is technically accurate, and it tells you almost nothing about what actually happened. Here is what actually happened. William spent 3 years building a case so thorough and so carefully documented that by the time he walked into that corridor, there was not a single person in that building with the authority or the appetite to stop him. Not the press office, not the senior household, not Charles, and certainly not Camilla. He moved her family out of the royal machine the way he does everything that matters to him. Quietly, methodically, and so completely that by the time anyone outside those walls understood what had happened, it was already irreversible. I am Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family. The records, the financial accounts, the reporting that got buried before anybody finished asking questions. What you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. The last thing in this story is not a dramatic confrontation. It is a number, and when you hear it in context, you will understand exactly what kind of operation this actually was. The people. Nobody talks about the names matter, because this story does not make sense without them. When most people think about Camilla's arrival into the royal family, they think about the woman herself. The ring, the title, the crown at Westminster Abbey in May 2023. What they do not think about is the network that arrived with her, because Camilla did not walk into the institution alone. She brought her family, and her family embedded themselves into the royal machine with a thoroughness that would have been impressive if anyone had been paying close enough attention to notice. Annabelle Elliott, Camilla's sister. If you have not come across her name before, that is partly by design. Annabelle is an interior designer, genuinely talented, with a client list that existed long before her sister married a king. But what that client list looked like after her sister married a king is a different conversation entirely. She became the person who shaped the interior of virtually every royal residence Camilla touched. Clarence's house, Ray Mill, sections of Highgrove, and projects connected to the Duchy of Cornwall, that vast estate of 135,000 acres and £30 million of annual income that William inherited the moment Charles walked out of Westminster Abbey with a crown on his head. Some of that work ran through proper channels, but a significant portion of it ran on informal access, which is a polite way of saying a woman with no official role inside the palace was influencing decisions about how public money was spent because her sister was beside the man who controlled the budget. Then there is Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, a food writer with genuine charm and a real career built on his own terms. Nobody disputes that, but Tom moved through the network of people adjacent to the crown with an ease that went beyond what his byline could explain. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, operated similarly, quieter, less visible, but present in the right rooms at the right moments. None of them did anything obviously wrong. William's case was never about obvious wrongdoing. It was about something more structural. And when he looked up from the duchy accounts and saw the pattern, he already knew exactly what it was. The arrangement. that was never written down. You have to understand what the Duchy of Cornwall actually is before you can understand why what William found in those accounts mattered so much. The duchy is not a hobby. It is not a ceremonial title with a crest on some letterhead and a small office somewhere that nobody visits. It is a fully operational estate with farms, forests, urban properties, marine holdings, and financial investments spread across England and beyond. When Charles was Prince of Wales, he ran it. He made the decisions, set the priorities, signed off on the expenditure. When William became Prince of Wales in September 2022, the moment Charles was proclaimed king, the duchy passed to him. And William, being William, did not simply step into the existing structure and keep it running the way it had always run. He audited it. He brought in his own people. He reviewed the contracts. He looked at where the money was going and who was in the room when the decisions were made. He did it the way he has done everything since he was given real institutional authority to do anything, which is with a thoroughness that people who work with him describe as close to forensic. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just complete. And what he found was not a scandal in the tabloid sense. There were no missing millions, no obvious fraud, nothing that a prosecutor would recognize as a case. What he found was a pattern of arrangements that existed nowhere on paper, but that had been shaping decisions about duchy projects, residences, and spending for years, arrangements that connected directly to people in Camilla's family. This is how informal power works inside an institution like this. People outside these buildings tend to imagine corruption as something dramatic. A brown envelope, a secret meeting, a clear transaction between two people who know exactly what they are doing. That is not how it works in places like this. It looks like a phone call to a trusted contact, a recommendation passed along by someone whose opinion the decision-maker respects, a contract that goes to a firm with the right connections rather than the lowest tender. And nobody writes down why, because everybody already knows, and nobody thinks they are doing anything wrong. They are just doing what has always been done, keeping things inside a trusted circle, because the trusted circle has always produced results. William has one response to that kind of arrangement. He replaced outside contractors who operated on handshake agreements with formal tendering processes. He removed advisors whose relationships with the estate ran through personal loyalty rather than documented competence. He introduced transparency structures that meant every significant spending decision left a paper trail that any senior official could follow without having to ask anybody who knew somebody. He said nothing publicly about why, because William never says publicly why. He simply changes the thing and lets the change do the talking. But the duchy was only the beginning. Once he had cleaned up its informal arrangements, his team started mapping similar patterns in adjacent structures, in the patronages connected to the wider royal household, in the project spending attached to Clarence House, in the overlap between Annabel Elliott's interior work and properties inside William's own estate. What that map showed him was that the informal network was not contained to one corner of the institution. It ran through it like a root system, underground, invisible, and load-bearing in ways that nobody had ever been asked to put into writing. The document that changed the temperature of everything was not dramatic. It was an ordinary contractor record from a duchy property in the southwest, a renovation project commissioned during Charles's tenure, still being invoiced against the estate after William took over. His team Cross referenced it against the wider accounts and found that the primary contractor had a documented relationship with Annabel Elliott's design firm. Not hidden, sitting in the business records for anyone to look at. But nobody had looked because the commission was signed on a personal recommendation from someone who never declared their connection to the contractor. William put that document in a physical folder and added 3 others. A patronage recommendation letter from 2021. A project approval from 2019, with no independent tender on record. A duchy advisory appointment from 2018 with no formal terms of reference. 4 documents from 4 different years telling the same story. He sat with that folder for 2 weeks before he showed it to anyone. Not because he was uncertain, because he was making sure there was no counter-argument he had not already answered before he walked into a room where someone was going to offer one. By the time he was ready to move, there wasn't one. That is the man Catherine once described to a close friend as the most patient person she had ever met. She did not entirely mean it as a compliment. Annabelle Elliott, the one nobody saw coming. Of all the names in this story, Annabelle Elliott's is the one that the palace has worked hardest to keep out of the conversation, and that effort has been so successful that most people reading about this family have never encountered it at all, which tells you a great deal about how thorough the management of her profile has been and who had the motivation to manage it. Annabelle is 12 years older than Camilla. She was the one who introduced Camilla to Andrew Parker Bowles, the man Camilla married in 1973 and divorced in 1995. She was present at the beginning of the story that eventually reshaped the British monarchy, and she has been present somewhere inside it ever since. Her interior design work is genuinely distinguished. The people who have hired her outside the royal circle speak about her with real admiration, but the scale of her access to royal properties after Camilla became a working royal and then queen consort went beyond what professional reputation alone could explain. She worked on Clarence House. She worked on Ray Mill. She was involved in design decisions at Highgrove that other professionals in her field have described as remarkable access for a private contractor operating without a formal, tendered appointment to the royal household, and some of that work ran against duchy properties. Properties that, after September 2022, belonged not to Charles, but to William. When William's team formally requested a complete record of all contractor relationships connected to duchy properties going back 10 years, Annabelle's name appeared in the resulting documentation in connection with 4 separate projects. 2 of them predated William's inheritance of the estate. 2 of them did not. That second number is the important one. 2 projects where Camilla's sister had an undeclared professional connection to work being done on William's own estate. Not historic work, not inherited commitments that nobody could have anticipated. Work commissioned or continued after he was already in charge. Work that should have been subject to the transparency standards he had introduced the moment he took over. Work that had somehow slipped through those standards without triggering any of the flags his systems were specifically designed to raise. William removed Annabelle's access to duchy properties in the autumn of 2023. No announcement, no statement, no press release. The projects she was connected to were reviewed, the contractor relationships were formally closed, and new appointments were made through the tendering process William's team had introduced. By the time Camilla became aware that it had happened, it was already done. And by the time she understood the full scope of what had been reviewed, her sister was already out. That is how William operates when he has decided something. You find out it happened at the same time you find out it is finished. The conversation. Charles could not stop. The meeting happened at Kensington Palace, William's residence, not Buckingham Palace, not Clarence House, Kensington, and the choice of location sent a signal before anyone opened their mouth, the same way it had the last time William called a meeting about Camilla and brought a physical folder to the table. Charles came with one senior aide. William had 2. The folder sat on the table between them, and William left it closed for the first few minutes of the conversation, which people who have been in rooms with him say is a deliberate habit. He wants you to know it is there before he opens it. Then he walked his father through it. Not aggressively, not with any performance of anger. The people who have described William in moments like this consistently use the same language. They say he is very calm. They say the calm is more unsettling than shouting would be. because it tells you that the person sitting opposite you has been over the ground so many times that there is nothing you can say that he is not already prepared for. Charles pushed back. Of course he did. He is the king, and this is his wife's family, and he has spent 30 years being the person who stood between Camilla and every institution that tried to push her out of the room. He told William that Annabelle's work was professional, that the projects were completed satisfactorily, that what looked like a governance gap on paper was in practice simply the way things had always operated, and the way they had always operated had worked perfectly well. William let him finish. Then he said one thing. He said that the way things had always operated was precisely the problem he had been hired to fix. Not by a board, not by a government minister, by the institution itself, by Charles, who had publicly endorsed the reform agenda William had been implementing across the duchy and the wider household since 2022. By the same man sitting across the table telling him the reforms should not apply to his wife's sister. Charles went quiet. People who know Charles say that particular silence, the one that comes after someone has said something he cannot immediately answer, is one of the most telling things about him. He is not a man who concedes a point out loud in the moment. He sits with it. He thinks. And then he does the thing that he has done in every significant confrontation with his elder son over the past 3 years, which is that he does not override the decision William has already made. He did not call Annabelle and tell her William had misunderstood the situation. He did not instruct his own household to restore the access that had been removed. He asked William, quietly, to handle whatever followed with discretion, and to consider Camilla's feelings in how the wider family conversation was managed. William said he would be respectful. He did not say he would be slow. The meeting ended. Charles went back to Buckingham Palace, and what happened over the next 4 weeks told the wider royal household everything they needed to know about which direction the wind was now blowing. What Camilla did next. She pushed back. That is the honest account of it. Camilla, when she understood the full scope of what had been done and what was still coming, did not simply absorb the loss quietly. She is not built that way. She has survived too much to be passive when something she cares about is being taken from her. She called people. She made the case to senior household officials that William's governance review was being applied selectively, that other informal arrangements across the royal machine had not been subjected to the same scrutiny, and that singling out her family represented something more personal than institutional. And she was not entirely wrong about that last point, which is actually the most interesting part of her argument. William was not treating every informal arrangement in the royal household with the same microscopic attention he was giving to the ones connected to Camilla's family. He had priorities, and his priorities were not random. But here's the problem with Camilla's counter-argument, and the reason it ultimately went nowhere. She was asking an institution that runs on precedent to make an exception for her family on the basis that other exceptions had been made for other people in the past. And the man she was making that argument to had spent his entire adult life trying to end the practice of making exceptions. You cannot argue against a transparency standard by pointing out that transparency was not applied consistently before. That argument lands differently in a building where the person who sets the standards is the same person who is now enforcing them. It lands as confirmation that the old arrangement needed to go. Her calls to senior officials produced nothing. 2 of them, people who had operated comfortably inside the old informal structure for years, gave her careful and sympathetic answers, and then went straight to Kensington Palace to report the conversation. That is the thing about a loyalty shift inside a royal household. It does not announce itself. You only discover it has happened when you realize the people you thought were on your side have been filing reports to the other building. Then she went to Charles. And this is where the story turns in the way that stories about Camilla and Charles always eventually turn, because Charles is the variable in everything. When he has been willing and able to protect her, the institution has bent around her. When he is not, or cannot, she is completely exposed. She put it to him plainly. She told him that William was using governance as a cover for something personal, that her family were being targeted, that what had been done to Annabelle was humiliating and unjust, and that she needed him to step in the way he had always stepped in. Charles heard her out. And then he did the thing he had done in the corridor of Buckingham Palace during the portrait incident, and on the phone during the yacht scandal, and in every significant moment over the previous 2 years, when his wife and his heir had arrived at the same junction from opposite directions. He went quiet. He told her he had already spoken to William. He told her the decision had been made on the basis of documented evidence, and he told her, gently, that he was not in a position to reverse it. The look on her face in that moment was described by one source close to the household as the look of someone who has just understood that the floor they were standing on has not been where they thought it was. The 4 words. The corridor conversation happened 3 days after the meeting between William and Charles. Camilla had not slept properly in a week. She was at Clarence House, which was her ground, the place inside this institution where she had always been able to exist on her own terms. And William came to her. That is the detail people have focused on, and they are right too. Because William coming to Camilla, on her ground, at a moment of his choosing, is a deliberate act. He did not summon her. He did not ask her to come to Kensington. He came to the building she called home, and he found her in a corridor between the drawing room and the private dining room in the mid-morning, with the kind of lighting that makes a corridor feel like a very long room when the conversation in it is going badly. He was not unkind. Everyone who has described this exchange is consistent about that. He was not cold or sneering or triumphant in any visible way. He is too controlled for any of that. He spoke to her in the measured, even tone that people who deal with him regularly describe as the voice he uses when a decision has been made and he is delivering it rather than discussing it. He told her that the formal review of all household arrangements connected to the duchy and the wider estate was ongoing, and that its conclusions would be implemented in full regardless of any personal considerations. He told her that the contracts associated with her sister had been correctly identified as non-compliant with the transparency standards now in place, and that those contracts would not be renewed or replaced under the current structure. And then he said the thing that has been repeated in every private account of that morning since. He told her that the informal arrangements her family had operated inside for the past 15 years could not continue. 4 words. You can't stay here. Not her personally. Not Camilla. From Clarence House. The network, the arrangement, the invisible infrastructure of family access and informal influence that had grown up around her over a decade and a half, and that had never been written down because it never needed to be, because Charles was always there to make sure nobody looked too hard. Charles was not there, and William had looked as hard as it is possible to look. She did not respond immediately. Sources describe her as standing very still for a moment, the kind of still that is not calm, but is the thing you reach when every immediate response available to you is one you cannot afford to use. She could not shout. She could not weep. She could not threaten. There was nothing in her arsenal that applied to a man standing in a corridor delivering a conclusion that was already written down in a folder somewhere with 4 years of documented evidence behind it. She said that Charles would hear about this. William told her that Charles already had, and then he left the corridor. The fallout. Across the family. The weeks after that corridor conversation produced a reorganization of the royal household that most of the outside world has still not fully understood, because it happened in the language of institutional administration rather than the language of family conflict. And institutional administration is the most effective camouflage there is. Tom Parker Bowles was not removed from anything because he had never held a formal position to remove him from. But the invitations stopped. The informal inclusion in events where his proximity to the crown had always been the implicit reason for his presence became less automatic, and then not automatic at all. Social calendars that had carried his name in the margins for years were quietly rearranged. The phone calls that used to come from household staff, making sure he was available for this dinner or that engagement, stopped coming. He noticed. Of course he noticed. A man that's socially perceptive does not miss the moment a room changes temperature. But there was nothing concrete for him to point at, because nothing concrete had been done to him. He simply discovered that the access he had always had was contingent on something that was no longer in place. And the thing it had been contingent on was never the thing anybody said out loud. Laura Lopes went through the same experience in a quieter register. Less publicly connected, less visible in the official orbit, she felt the shift through the smaller social mechanisms of the royal world. The events her family had attended, as a matter of course, becoming events her family attended by specific invitation only, the specific invitations becoming less frequent, and then becoming occasional, and then stopping. Annabelle Elliott was the one who had the most to lose in concrete terms, because Annabelle's connection to the royal household was not purely social. It had a professional dimension, and that dimension had been generating real income through real projects for the better part of a decade. The removal of her access to duchy properties was a commercial loss, as well as a personal one. She put out no statement. No complaint reached the press from her direction. She absorbed it in the way that women in that family have always absorbed the things the institution does to them, which is by not giving the institution the satisfaction of reacting visibly. Inside the palace, the staff read the situation with the speed that palace staff always read situations. They are professionals at understanding which way power is running through a building without anyone ever having to draw them a diagram. And what they understood by the middle of the autumn was that Camilla's family were no longer a center of gravity, that it was useful to orbit. The small courtesies that had always been extended to them, the extra consideration, the communication that went just slightly beyond what protocol strictly required, the general warmth of people who understood that being kind to the Queen Consort's family was a sensible career decision. All of it contracted quietly and without ceremony. Nobody announced that it was happening. Nobody needed to. That is what a power shift feels like from the inside of the institution it moves through. The air changes before anything else does. Diana, underneath all of it, I have told you the governance version of this story because the governance version is real and it matters. The documented evidence is real. The transparency failures are real. The informal network and its removal are real, and they happened in exactly the way I have described them. But if you want to understand why William moved with the particular completeness that he did, if you want to understand why the review was as thorough as it was, why the folder had 4 years of documentation in it rather than 1, why he came to that corridor himself rather than sending anyone else, you have to go back to the thing that is always underneath everything in this family. Diana died in Paris in August 1997. She died having been systematically stripped of her institutional support, her protection, her title in its formal sense, and her presence inside the royal residences where she had built a life. The stripping happened piece by piece, in the way that the most effective removals always happen, through a series of decisions, each of which was small enough that objecting to any individual one made you look unreasonable. And it was done, at least in part, through informal mechanisms, through arrangements that existed nowhere on paper, through the quiet operation of a network that had access to the institution and used that access to push one woman further and further out until she was outside entirely. William knows this. He has known it since he was old enough to understand what the word informal means when it is applied to power inside a building like that. And he spent 25 years watching a different informal network do a different version of the same thing in the same rooms. Not to his mother this time, but with his mother's memory, with his mother's portrait, with the spaces his mother had occupied and the patronages she had built and the charities she had given herself to. All of it managed out of the institution through a process of gradual, undocumented, deniable diminishment. When William looks at an informal arrangement that benefits Camilla's family at the expense of the institution's integrity, he is not seeing only a governance failure. He is seeing the shape of something he has spent his entire life learning to recognize, and he has absolutely no patience left for it. One senior official described it to a journalist who was not supposed to publish it, and published it anyway. They said that William is not a man who believes in ghosts. He is a man who believes in patterns, and the pattern he found in the duchy accounts was one he had seen before. He was not going to let it run a third time. Charles said something after the corridor conversation that reached 2 or 3 people before it was supposed to reach anyone. He said he understood why William had done what he had done. He said he was not certain he would have had the nerve to do it himself. And then he said the thing that nobody who heard it has been able to forget, which is that Diana would have considered the whole thing long overdue. Coming from the man who was married to her, that sentence carries a weight that no press release will ever come close to. Where it stands now, Camilla still holds her title. She still appears at state occasions. She still walks beside Charles at the events that require both of them to be present, and she carries herself with the bearing of a woman who has outlasted every attempt to diminish her for 50 years and does not intend to stop now. None of that has changed, and it is not going to change while Charles is alive and on the throne. But the family network is gone. Not reduced, not restructured into something smaller and more compliant. Gone. The informal infrastructure that spent 15 years growing through the royal institution, like something that was always going to be there, has been removed with the same systematic thoroughness that William has brought to every institution he has ever been given control over. The duchy accounts are clean. The contractor relationships are documented. The advisory appointments have written terms of reference. The decisions leave paper trails. Annabelle Elliott's work inside royal properties has ended. She is still a designer with a real career and real clients and genuine talent, and none of that has been taken from her. But she is not walking through the rooms of the Duchy of Cornwall anymore. She is not being recommended for projects by household officials who know her family connection and consider it a recommendation in itself. The door that was always open to her on the basis of who her sister is has closed, and the mechanism that closed it was built specifically so that it cannot be reopened by a phone call from Clarence House. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes exist in a social relationship with the institution that is now accurately described as family rather than network. They are the stepchildren of the king. They attend family occasions. They are treated with courtesy. And the layer of informal access and quiet influence that sat underneath that family relationship and gave it a professional and financial dimension has been stripped away entirely. The question that nobody inside that palace will answer out loud is the one that Charles has been asking William privately for 2 years. It is the question about what happens after. After Charles is gone. After Camilla becomes Queen Dowager with a title and a residence, and no husband to provide the protective authority that has been the foundation of everything she has inside this institution. Because when Charles dies, the man who decides how much institutional support Camilla receives, how large her household is, how much access she has to the residences, how her family is treated in the margins of royal life. That man is William. And William has just spent 3 years demonstrating in documented, irreversible, legally airtight detail exactly what kind of king he is going to be. He is the kind who brings a folder to the table, the kind who sits with a piece of information for 2 weeks before he moves on it, the kind who builds the ground underneath a decision so thoroughly that by the time anyone realizes it has been made, every possible route to reversing it has already been closed. He is also the kind who walked behind his mother's coffin at 15 years old, with his face completely still, and spent the next 25 years building toward the day he had the authority to do something about what had been done to her. Camilla spent those same 25 years believing she had won. She had the title. She had the crown. She had the walls of the palace arranged the way she wanted them. She had her family embedded in the institution in the way that families who belong to institutions eventually become embedded in them. And she had Charles, who had never once in 30 years of loving her failed to step between her and the thing that was coming. She discovered in a corridor at Clarence House that Charles could not step between her and this one. Not because he did not love her. He loves her completely and has proved it at enormous personal cost in front of the entire world for the better part of 50 years. But because the thing that was coming was not a press story, or a public opinion, or an institution with the power to be persuaded by a king, it was his son, holding a folder with 4 years of documentation in it, and a sentence ready that was not a threat and not a negotiation. The number I promised you at the start, the one that tells you what kind of operation this actually was, 4 years. That is how long William's team had been collecting the documentation before he used it. Not 3 years, not 2, 4. Since before Charles was king, since before Camilla was queen consort, since before any of the formal institutional authority that made the final move possible was actually in William's hands. He started building the case before he had the power to act on it. Because that is what you do when you are the kind of person who learned at 15 that saying a true thing at the wrong moment gets you nothing except the satisfaction of having said it. He waited until the moment was right. Then he walked into a corridor, and 4 words did the rest.